Hello, everyone. My name is Lamia. Maybe we'll just wait a minute or two for everyone to log on. Let's just wait like 2 minutes and then we'll get started, giving everyone time to find the stream. Okay. Let's maybe just get started introducing and then we'll start the discussion. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Lamia. I do communications with Mizna. I'm here to welcome you today to the filmmaker discussion between Kamal Aljafari and Kareem Estefan. The March program presented as part of the Mizna Film Series in collaboration with the Mosaic Rooms. The Mizna Film Series is a monthly selection of programs expanding our regular film programming to include screenings, critical essays, filmmaker interviews, and discussions, exploring revolutionary forms of cinema from the SWANA region and beyond. This series is presented virtually and in person with the Trilon Cinema. Our co-presenters, the Mosaic Rooms, is a gallery and bookshop for contemporary arts and culture from the Arab world and beyond, and a project of the A.M. Qattan Foundation in London. They include this month's screening and discussion as part of public programming affiliated with When I See the Future, I Close My Eyes, Hiba Amin's first UK solo exhibition at the Mosaic Rooms. It's curated by Anthony Downey and it's on view through June 6th. This month, the Mizna Film Series screens An Unusual Summer by Kamal Aljafari, a film based on found surveillance footage, which captures everyday fleeting moments of poetry while in the background, the daily choreography of Ramle under Israeli occupation comes to the surface. If you haven't already watched it, An Unusual Summer is available for free virtually through tomorrow. There are a few tickets left. And you can also read my essay analyzing the film at mizna.org. Be sure to tune in to the upcoming Mizna Film Series screenings and events as we continue our surveillance-themed spring season. In April, we're screening Al Asliyin by Marwan Hamid. And in May, we screen Empty Metal by Adam Khalil and Bailey Schweitzer. Before we begin, I'll introduce our guests. So Kamal Aljafari, born Palestine in 1972, works with moving images and still images, interweaving between fiction, nonfiction, and art. His past films include Recollection, Port of Memory, and The Roof, and he was a featured artist at the Robert Flaherty Film Seminar in New York, and is a fellow at the Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute and Film Study Center. An Unusual Summer premiered at Vision du Réel in 2020 and went on to be presented at several international film festivals, winning several awards. And currently, Aljafari is editing his forthcoming film, Velvet Voyage, about a crime committed against an archive. And joining us is Kareem Estefan. He will be in discussion with Aljafari. Kareem is an arts writer, editor, and PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University, writing a dissertation on witnessing and world building in Palestinian visual culture. His essays and reviews have appeared in numerous cultural publications, including 4 columns, Art in America, Frieze, Ibraz, Journal of Palestine Studies, The New Inquiry, and Third Text, among others. Kareem is co-editor of Assuming Boycott, Resistance, Agency, and Cultural Production, an anthology of essays on cultural boycotts, transnational solidarities, and self-censorships in the arts. And I'm happy to hand it off to you, Kareem.
Thank you so much, Lamia, and thank you to both Mizna and the Mosaic Rooms for hosting us. I'm excited to be speaking with Kamal Aljafari today, and I'll also just say that we will be taking questions from the audience after speaking for a while, so you're welcome to post any questions that you have for Kamal in the chat. So Aljafari's films are poignant depictions of the slow violence that is experienced by Palestinians and by the built environment in cities he grew up in, Jaffa and Ramle, since Zionist forces displaced the vast majority of their populations, including his family, in 1948. They're also, I think, quietly radical films in the kind of attention they call for in viewers, in the extraordinary perceptiveness to architecture, to sound, to all kinds of background figures, human and non-human, that Kamal cultivates. And that's true from Kamal's first feature film, The Roof, released in 2006, to his latest, An Unusual Summer, which Lamia described for those of you who have not had a chance to see it yet. I also really recommend reading her excellent essay on the film. So I want to start before asking you more about some of the formal and thematic choices in this film and in others of yours. Just if you could recount seeing this surveillance footage for the first time, what struck you about it and what led you to make this film?
Thank you, Kareem. Thank you, Lamia and Mizna. When I saw the material, I quickly understood the importance of this discovery. So I had, in my head, material where there was a documentation, a non-stop documentation of this one corner of the street where I was born in Ramle. And it's true that the main objective of this recordings of this camera was to capture or find the culprit, the person who threw the stone and broke the car window. But at the same time, as this camera is automatic and it has its own subjectivity, it recorded everything. So it's a kind of work that only a machine can do, unless you have the patience of a machine. I mean, no filmmaker will sit there and film for 24 hours. And somehow it reminded me a lot of the kind of nature films that people would make, where they would stay somewhere for a long time and observe animal life or whatever they are documenting, nature. And I really like this character, the nature character of this footage, and especially as someone who's minimalist, I was very much attracted to this material and I wanted to do something with it. Of course, add to that the fact that this was a very personal material, because I could share and live with my family, the daily life of my family, day and night, and imagine what's going on inside the house, because when they leave the frame, they either go in or leave the house, go somewhere else that I don't know where they go to. So the material itself, was really a treasure that I found, and then finally, even making a film for me was a miracle, because this footage managed to record the unrecorded. The people of Ramle, the people who live in the ghetto of Ramle, the people who were categorized as ghetto people, a term which was brought by the occupiers from Europe right after, right with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot in there that we can discuss. First, this kind of patience of the machine. I'm struck by how you give the machine a bit of a subjectivity there in speaking about what it records as opposed to what you record. Of course, I'd say, you have remarkable patience in your own filmmaking, that comes out in your films, but this is also a static camera, right? It's not moving. It doesn't have any of the, what we often describe as subjective choices of the filmmaker to pan, to zoom in, although you do manipulate the image in certain ways that we can discuss. But, with this comparison to nature films, then I wonder, in relation to a disparaged neighborhood, one that's racialized by being called the ghetto, what it means to look at it with a static shot in particular, and also with surveillance, which of course is thought of as an apparatus of domination that criminalizes a population. The link between surveillance and the ghetto is very easy, but there's also a kind of intimacy that I think you give the footage because of your niece's narration, which we will talk about, because of the intertitles that say, very personal things about people in the neighborhood. So I just wonder if you want to speak to that tension between, the subjectivity in the machine or surveillance and what is kind of, feels like a video diary to me of the neighborhood that you know so well.
There are a lot of things to talk about there in your question. So first, I was very puzzled by the amount of details that this one single frame managed to capture. I mean, what happens when you don't move the frame, don't move the camera, is that things start to exist either inside this frame or outside this frame. So inside the frame, you have, an entire life of passers-by passing, and they go, they do what they do usually, and they don't even notice that there's a camera and there's someone or there's a machine filming them. And this in itself is quite fascinating, but because what this camera did was a kind of casting. And the people who passed by the most, who existed the most in front of this camera, ended up being in my film. And it's a kind of, a process where everybody was equal. And I described that in the film itself in one of the notes, that on my father's camera, everyone has a chance to exist. And this is referring to many things related to the Palestinian experience itself, because in fact, we do not exist socially, economically, and politically in our own country, a country that eventually was renamed, and we became ghosts in this country, in our own country. And what really puzzled me the most when I discovered the material is here we have recording of the ghetto, recording of an entire community that nobody ever thought about documenting. And this part was particularly cinematic for me, because in my work, I am very much interested in people on the margins, whether in reality or in fiction, like I did in Recollection, finding all these people who were on the margins of the frame or in the background of the frame, and eventually making them the main subject of the film. So this was the main, if you want, objective of my work, is to make these people who are basically no one, to make them the subject of the film and to have them as the main actors of the film. And at the same time, of course, it is really fascinating to see the daily life of, from my side, from one part, my family, and of course as well of the entire neighborhood of people that I haven't seen for so many years, and it brought back so many memories about them. I was referring before to this material and this film as a nature film, because for the first time I realized, oh, there is these two sisters that I remember from my childhood that always walk together, or this man who always wakes up so early in the morning and he wanders around. And this is the kind of stuff that you don't really notice if you don't have the patience of the camera, of the machine. And one single, frame, a non-moving frame, is exactly what this machine is. Having the patience to record without being bored about things happening or not happening. So this was, for me, aesthetically speaking, a perfect tool that I could work with, a language that I like, a language that I could express myself with. So in terms of the intimacy, surely surveillance camera is not meant to be used for making a film or for any kind of personal expression. But exactly for that reason, I was very much, excited about subverting this medium, which is existing to control and to somehow criminalize people, to subvert it and to use it as a form of personal expression, as a cinematic personal expression. And in fact, I was thinking when I was working on the film, this is the dream of the filmmaker. I mean, where do you have a camera that is standing there and filming nonstop and doing the work for you, in fact, and is more patient than you for sure as a filmmaker, and then you can come back to it and start the process of selecting. Now, the camera itself does not select. The camera is unselective. It is selective in a sense that it is positioned in one angle, and it is finally, there's nothing like objective camera. It is subjective. It is subjectivity of the camera itself. And then everything else that was being added by me, whether the narration in form of text or sounds that I recorded, or the sound of the voice of my niece, there were different types of subjectivity that was added to the subjectivity of the camera. And slowly, in this process of making the film, which was a combination of notes that I took while making the film, which ended up becoming the language of the film, the intertitles, like in silent cinema, and the process of editing itself and recording in location a couple of times, and doing the Foley's, and then doing an experiment, recording the sound of my niece watching the rough cut. All of that, none of it was really planned. It's not the kind of film that you think that you can write. So, the writing, sorry?
Oh, sorry. I just want to ask you then about how you think of it in terms of maybe a kind of storytelling, or what voices are there, what if it's a collaboration of kinds, because you're saying the camera, it doesn't select, you select, but also the camera was set up by your father in terms of the angle it was pointed at in the first place. And then you have the story in a sense that you tell both through the title cards and through the anecdotes, poetic, political anecdotes at the end. And there's your niece's narration. So yeah, what if there's a voice, like a first person, maybe a plural first person voice in the film? Do you see it as a collaborative storytelling? What do you think about, the different subjectivities at work in the film?
So the first thing that I have to admit that, making this film was a big challenge, because this was the first time where I was watching material, and it was really difficult for me to choose, because all the takes were good. People walk the way they should walk. I mean, they're not actors; they are perfect actors. And finally, the main question that I had to ask myself: what is it that I want to express? It was funny, the personal perspective and point of view that made it possible for this film to be made, to exist. And in this personal perspective, with this personal perspective, I could, dig in more inside this material and discover all these stories that you just mentioned, all the neighbors, all the life that exists and still exist in front of the camera. And when I thought about my niece, it was really an idea that I wanted to have a voice of someone who has a subjectivity which is pure, with no relation to time and history. Because my own subjectivity is very related to what I know about this place and to a certain definition of time, while for my niece, this definition of time that exists for us as adults, that it doesn't really exist, or if it exists, it is very abstract. So this point was very intriguing for me to work with, and I didn't know whether it will work out or not. It was just an experiment, and it was a beautiful one, because finally I discovered that my niece is very poetic the way she looks at things, and says things, and this adds another layer of intimacy. So things are not really the I that you might be referring to. It's not only me, it's many people. It's sometimes me, sometimes even the characters that appear in this film. I'm trying to give voice to all these people and do with sound, in fact, what this camera did, what my father did with the camera in making the image, is to make everyone exist in sound.
So, when you said the line about everyone has a chance to exist, I was thinking about visibility and the tension, between this is Edward Said once described the struggle, Palestinian struggle in terms of cinema, as a struggle for visibility, and he spoke about invisibility on the one hand and hypervisibility on the other hand, which he described as kind of stereotypes of Palestinians, masked, kafiyad militants. But now you're saying this, I'm wondering if actually you're looking for an existence that disrupts visibility as a paradigm for who appears, who is included, who is given a chance to exist. Can you maybe talk about what you were saying there about sound as a way of showing existence a little bit more?
Sorry?
Oh, I was just saying, if you can speak to sound as a way in which you gave people maybe a material life or existence in this film.
It's very interesting because when you watch surveillance camera, because it has no sound, it is somehow has zero emotions and intimacy. And for me, while watching the material, it was different, because I knew these characters, I knew it's my family, so somehow I could give sound and voices to everyone existing there. And only by adding sound, I could create emotions. Only by adding voices, I could create emotions and give meaning to things. And this is actually, very well resonates with Edward Said's ideas of, having permission to narrate. And there is no, in general, when we make films or we write as Palestinians, there is no place for complexity and interpretation, because interpretation is a kind of subversion tool for the powerless. So you could exist as a cliche, as you just mentioned, right? And in fact, I remember in the book, After the Last Sky, where Edward Said wrote essays for photographs made by John Moore. There was a portrait of an elderly Palestinian woman in a hairnet. I don't know if you know this particular picture, but it's very famous. And this elderly woman is smiling, and above the caption was written Amman 1984. And then Said noted, Said was reminded by his sister that this woman, Mrs. Faraj, he knew personally. And then he says in the essay something very beautiful. He says, I do not know whether the photograph can or does say things as they really are. And then he says, something has been lost, but the representation is all we have. And for me, this question of representation and the permission to narrate has been really very essential for my work, not by plan. It became like this because the way I work is very intuitive, and I work with subjects that arrive to me, like this movie. I haven't planned this film. This movie came to me. I think it is very important to go beyond the normal representation that we are required to, be in general as Palestinians.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned After the Last Sky, because I think, the way that Said writes so poetically about those photographs is very much, him seizing that kind of permission to narrate in a way that you don't see quite in the same ways, although he's a beautiful writer in his academic writing too, but it's really him performing this differently. I want to ask you about permission there in the title. It's something that I always think about when Said, in relation to his famous essay, he talks about media censorship of the Palestinian narrative, and that's of course important. He also talks about even, allies of Palestinians, critics of Israel's policies, not always including Palestinian voices in their narratives that are critiquing Israel. But there's also something maybe about the poetic act of representation that I think Palestinians don't have permission for. And I wonder where you see that permission denied. For example, is it in social expectations of what a Palestinian film will be? Is it that, Palestinians are expected to produce documentaries of their suffering? And does this manifest to you, when you're applying for funding, for example? At what different levels do you see that permission denied, or that you have to really fight for that permission?
It's a very interesting question, because I've been dealing with this issue for, so many times. And every time I make a film, I'm dealing with the same difficulties. Because you are not expected as a Palestinian to be an artist when you talk about Palestine. There is an expectation from you to, be a reporter. And many times to provide the viewer or the people who control media or art or cinema to provide them with the same image that they know from their daily newspapers or from the TV. And when you come with a film or an artwork which is going beyond simply talking about the subject, because I'm not just a filmmaker, I'm a certain type of filmmaker. And in that way, the way to make a film for someone like me is very long and it's very difficult, simply because in many ways we are uprooted twice. Once in reality, because we cannot exist, we are not allowed to exist, and second time even in fiction, even when we want to express our experience, it becomes very difficult because we are required to be one thing only. And I deal with this problem every time I start a new project, because I was saying before, you know, this complexity somehow becomes a danger, and this interpretation becomes a danger, where things can interpreted in a way that people in power position won't allow them to be, and somehow it also gives a lot of space for the viewer to think and to participate and to be active participant in the story and in the destiny of the Palestinians, or in the reality you are describing. So, you know, I in my first film, In the Roof, I had a lot of issues with because this film was commissioned by the German second TV station, and I had a lot of issues with the commissioning editor because he couldn't really see the cliches that he usually sees. So for him, a Palestinian family was confusing because he told me once it looks like an Italian family. So and then he was telling me, why people talk so softly in your film. This is the way my family talks, or the characters talk, because every time he sees a Palestinian, he is in hysteria and he's shouting. And this is the kind of image that he was interested in. And I was supposed to kind of recreate this image to him again. And this is exactly the experience that made me the filmmaker I am today. This first experience I had with the German commissioning editor, any commissioning editor will behave the same. They're all the same. Which made me really working working differently and becoming more radical in the way I treat images and my subjects.
And you know, it's very notable in in this film, in An Unusual Summer, that when you describe your family's displacement, or a little bit of the history behind the house, it's in anecdotes that are kind of conversational, kind of poetic, at the very end of the film, right after the surveillance footage, in the credits almost, or as credits. You know, in The Roof, you do have a little bit of that history at the beginning in a text, but also there you're doing, you know, something subversive with it, which is not to, you know, treat the subject sociologically in a way, but to say, there's a beautiful line in there, I think you say, my parents live on the first floor and the past lives above them. Can you say a little bit about also withholding information, or what you want to give and what you want to withhold there?
Yeah, I mean, I really ask myself this question quite often every time I work on a film, because you are faced by this dilemma of being, you know, a Palestinian, and you have to kind of, you know, show the reality and do the work of a documentarian, because everything that you are filming is disappearing or will disappear. And the part of me that wants to be more poetic And then many times I was thinking, I want to I do not want to suffer twice. I mean, I'm suffering, you know, or experiencing occupation and displacement. And at the same time, I want to free myself from that. And making films the way I make them is one way of freeing myself from this reality, from this limitation that is created by the colonial project in Palestine. So in a way, the subjects and everything is there in the image. The way I edit, the way I compose the images and work with the sound, the subject is there, and I kind of, you know, hide it in a way that the viewer can also find it. I mean, it's not a science, but it's a kind of process that I go through every time I make a film, where slowly it becomes a film about poetry, about the need to create poetry in the darkest circumstances we're in. And this is the part that I enjoy the most in making the films, is to take such material like the surveillance camera and to turn it into poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to, on that note, ask you more about time in the film, especially since we spoke a bit about your niece's narration, and I want to highlight and her perception of time. You mentioned, you know, the first words in the film are her saying "Haida min zaman," you know, saying it's from a long, long time ago. It almost, I mean, I almost thought about Kanya Makan, about Once Upon a Time, that she gives an almost fable-like beginning to what is documentary footage, surveillance footage. And she, you know, it's a long, long time ago for her. It's 10, 15 years ago from when you're recording. And I'm sure the time feels very different for you. But the footage that we watch also, you know, you're playing with time in different ways. You're speeding it up, slowing it down, pausing it, playing it in reverse. And also we see timestamps at different moments, but they're never chronological. You move forward and backward, and maybe the rhythms are following your perception. Maybe the rhythms are kind of the social rhythms of the neighborhood. There's also the fact that this is taking place in July 2006, which for many people in Palestine and Lebanon and in the region, you know, that they'll have a lot of associations with what was going on that summer, but that doesn't come up in the film. So I just, you know, these are a few different observations just for you to speak broadly about time in the film.
So in regard to my niece, I was really very inspired by the way she was describing things, and she wasn't even born when this footage was made in 2006. She's just 9 years old now. So her approach, her expression of what she sees in the image is very pure and very somehow immediate. She has no really reflections the way we have reflections, right? She's a child. And when I did the recording, when I did the recording of her voice, I just let her watch the rough cut, and everything she says really came from her. I didn't give her any directions. So she started, you know, describing what she sees, and she has a very, you know, she's a child and she has a very tender voice, and she became very emotional when she saw her grandfather, and this voice added a lot of emotions, and her subjectivity, the subjectivity of her voice, her emotions towards the images was quite essential for giving these images the meaning that Edward Said was talking about in After the Last Sky. You know, the image itself needs to be reworked, needs to be somehow connected to memories, to the intimacy of the characters that appear in the picture, in the photograph. So this part was quite important. I mean, this is another subjectivity, as I said before. It's my subjectivity. Other subjectivities also. I was very much interested in this generational aspect, because she is a child and she's looking at this footage with no really political awareness or understanding of what's going on or what is the meaning of this footage. For her, it was purely personal. It was just about these people appearing there that she knew or she didn't knew. She could connect with and she could not connect with. And something that I find fascinating about this footage, that it's very queer. Because in the footage, you cannot really differentiate between a man and a woman, between a child and an older person. They all existed equally. So when she was watching the footage, I was exactly thinking about, because she would see someone and say, "Oh, this is a little girl," but for me, when I watched it, it was a woman, an older woman, and this perception. This somehow diversity in the perception was quite fascinating, and referring, to the ways we see things. What was the other part? Sorry.
It was a broad question about time, if there's more you want to say, but also I can ask you another question.
The time is, the question of time is fascinating, because when I started working on this footage, I realized one day that it was recorded in July 2006. And I Googled just to be sure whether the war was exactly in July 2006, and it was. It was exactly this month of the war. Now, again, it's going back to your question, how much information and facts you put in a film. And finally, I made a decision not to say that it was the July war against Lebanon carried out by the Israeli army, but to say there was a war. Because for me, finally, there has been so many wars. And anyway, in the footage itself, you don't see any traces of the war. So there has been always a war. And during these wars and war, we exist, we live, and we have more or less the same issues and daily life. So I decided to say just the war, because I wanted really to eliminate this this tight definition of the war between Israel and the war of Israel against Lebanon. So the time itself, the way you experience it in the film, it is related to the editing, to the montage. It took me to places that I haven't really planned ahead of time. It was really like an exercise. And the first part was really about introducing the idea and, in fact, making a kind of an investigation and trying to find out who really threw the stone. And it was really sincere. I wanted to know who was this person that eventually made this film possible. Without him, my father wouldn't have installed the camera, and this footage wouldn't have existed. And then, this investigation becomes an investigation about, the neighborhood, and eventually about the nature of life. And all of that somehow became one, and in that sense, there was no clear definition of time. It wasn't about really defining time in this movie, but rather really having an expression of this specific place, and somehow wandering with them, making you be there in this neighborhood and be interested in these characters that nobody is interested in.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what you say about investigation here. First, I just want to say if anyone joined late, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll take some of those questions soon. But so, your father's attempt to discover the person breaking his car's windows, it's important, but it's also incidental to the film in the end. I mean, we see him identified, but it's not maybe the main focal point. And your film, though, does really capture this sense of searching. And I wonder if you could speak about also the ways you're searching within images themselves more broadly in your films. You mentioned Recollection, your 2015 film there, and maybe you could say a little bit about what you were doing in Recollection here, and if you see some similarities in terms of, the act of searching, of investigating images.
I think this is an experience very much diasporic. I mean, diasporic in a sense that even Palestinians who live in Palestine, who stayed in Palestine, they are diasporic because their country eventually was renamed. And growing up in Ramle and Jaffa, my mother's city, my mother comes from Jaffa. I was surrounded by traces of this old country. Now carrying a different name, there were in Ramle and Jaffa, there were stones, homes, people, which were not from Israel. I mean, I quickly understood, even as a child, there is a contradiction, and in a way, Israel was something, this name Israel was something foreign to us. So we accepted it, we lived there because we need to survive. And at the end, in the end credits, I tell the story of my father in 1967. One of the many stories that we carry with us. In 1967, when the West Bank was occupied, my father took his car and he drove to Jericho to look for his brother. He thought that he could just bring him back to Ramle. And he arrived to Okba Jabir, to the refugee camp, and he looked he searched for him. He arrived to the camp and it was empty. There was no one there. And his brother and his entire family were already in Amman. So basically they were displaced second time. And this search, for family members, for the country, for your history, is very essential for me, and I think for any Palestinian, for the Palestinian experience. And these stories, they exist within every family in Palestine. And in fact, it is very important to mention that it is not the past. I mean, this is not something that, we are talking about today because it's important to discuss the history and the past. No, it is really the present, very much the present. So this search, has been quite really important to me as a filmmaker. It's part of it's part of who I am, and it became very integral part of the kind of cinema and art I want to create. That it is, that it is finally also connecting with experiences of many marginalized and diasporic people all over the world. Yeah. And I think that's the part that fascinates me the most when I'm done with the film, that people who are not coming from Palestine, people who are from many other places can really see their history, their memory, their story in these movies.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, first of all, about saying this is present. And I, point back to how you said that the war is ongoing. I mean, of course, this is a long history of structural violence that can't be contained by dates like 1948 or 1967 or 2006, for that matter. The story that you tell about your father in 1967, I mean, it reminds me a little bit, as do other aspects of the stories in your last few films, of Ghassan Kanafani's returning to Haifa story, in the sense that, there's a moment in 1967 when families sometimes reunite across the so-called Green Line, and also the idea that, one Palestinian family might be displaced to another Palestinian family's home. But also just the question I think that you're asking here that comes up in that story, which is, what is homeland? And Kanafani, of course, in a sense, is defining the struggle as home. But it's also an open question there, the meaning of home. And I think that is something that really resonates in your films, partly because you cast your own family as your actors so many times, as non-actors, but as your cast. So yeah, it's a big question, but I wonder if you can reflect on home also, maybe in this film or in your films in general.
Finally, the more films I make, I'm realizing that cinema is becoming a kind of a country for me. And while you're talking now, I was reminded of the first film I made, The Roof, and I used there a quotation by the writer Anton Shammas. And he says, and you know perfectly well that we do not ever leave home. We simply drag it behind us wherever we go, walls, roof, and all. And, in a way, I don't feel that I ever left Palestine. I mean, the kind of work I do is always a reflection and a return to the first place. For example, the Unusual Summer, mysteriously enough, it was shot. This material was made in 2006, and it is the same year that I made my first film, The Roof. So it is really at the same time that I made my film, my father made his film. Or if you want, the house, this unfinished house, the second floor of the unfinished house with the unfinished second floor, that, as you mentioned, it in fact it's not our house. It's a house of another Palestinian family that was displaced, and my family was forced to take this house because the army in 1948 made the Palestinians who remained in Ramle, the few Palestinians who could remain, live in one place. They forced them to take these homes and live there. And this camera told the story from the point of view of the house, because all you see in the film is the shadow of this house. And this shadow of the house was possible only because the second floor has no roof. If the second floor had a roof, you couldn't have seen this shadow at all. So you needed the roof to be empty for the shadow to exist. And this is the kind of thing that make you wonder about the mystery of life, finally.
Yeah, and the shadows cast by 48 and their ongoing presence. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it is really the perspective of 1948. Showing everything and telling the story of all these people that are passers-by now, passers-by of the history, passers-by of the present. And this is exactly what I'm interested in making art and cinema.
And, you mentioned the Shamas quote about home, the walls, the roof, everything. I want to say too, that the human figure is often not really the central focal point in your filming. A characteristic shot of yours might be a camera panning across a wall for a long take. Often you're paying very close attention to the built environment, to debris, to ruins. And I wonder, if you could say something about what, in the way you're describing the house that your family was pushed into, what more broadly architecture and the built environment witnesses in Palestine, and what it can reveal in your films, maybe that is a different perspective than let's say the human perspective.
I think what fascinated me the most in making these films, the way I made them, was connecting with these traces. And in Port of Memory, the film begins with a long tracking shot of an abandoned house in Jaffa. And I remember when I shot this scene, I went there at 4 o'clock in the morning just by myself before everybody else came to, set the tracking and to film this building. And you are standing there in front of this building that was so big, with so many balconies, destroyed balconies now, and half of it you could see part of the interiors of this home, because half of it was destroyed. And then I get closer to the windows, and these windows were sealed by the municipality of Tel Aviv, and they added different kind of debris there from other destroyed homes. And when I look at this, and then with the camera, for me, this is expressing everything I wanted to express. This is the life that is there, that will never be possible to eliminate, despite the fact that there is an attempt to destroy and eliminate the history and the existence of these people there. But it still exists. The more you do, the more traces you find, because as a filmmaker, as an artist, I'm finding these traces in everything. I mean, in Jaffa, for example, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they destroyed, the municipality of Tel Aviv destroyed a lot of buildings. And they throw the debris into the sea. Until today, when the sea is high, and in winter, the sea throws back pieces of these homes. So you walk in the city, you walk on the beach one morning, and then you find traces of these homes. And the municipality of Tel Aviv sends people every year, every winter, to collect these again. So in a way, everything is buried there, and it's not possible to get rid of it finally. It's not possible.
Yeah. That's really haunting. I mean, thinking about also the different ways, of course, that forests are planted on destroyed villages, or different, almost ecological attempts at, or anti-ecological attempts at hiding Palestinian history. Yeah.
I mean, it's related to the will of the colonizers everywhere, whether in North America or in Africa, in Palestine for sure, in creating a new landscape, in destroying the original landscape and creating a new one. And by doing that, colonizers, they invent history. They claim they invent their own history in the place, a new history.
Well, I wanted to go back to our discussion of sound briefly before taking a question from the audience that we have, just to ask you about sound in An Unusual Summer, how you recorded it. I mean, we see a close resemblance at times between the image and the sound, but of course you had to have made so many different decisions about how to reconstruct sound in this film. Could you speak more about your decisions there?
So I started editing this film without sound. So you can imagine it was sometimes very difficult because I was just working with images. And then the first thing I started was to create Foley's steps and to give feelings to the characters we see. And this wasn't enough. So I decided to go to Ramle and to record sound. I went a couple of times. And it was really going back and forth between syncing and unsyncing. Every time it was to sync, it sounded too perfect for a surveillance camera. So I had really to find the right balance between what I wanted to express, how I want to use the sound, sound serving, as I said before, to create emotions, to give intimacy to the image, but at the same time to have the sound heard like the image looks destroyed. So it was really going back and forth between recording, destroying, adding, removing, and it was a long process. The editing of the sound was much longer than the editing of the image, because it was endless what you could do there. Everything was to be synced, so there was no sound there. Everything you see is created. So you could go in different directions. But as always, I'm more a minimalist filmmaker. I like to reduce things because by this reduction, I feel like I can better express the poetry I want to express.
Yeah, and I can see how it's mostly corresponding, but just a little bit off at times in a way that becomes somewhat uncanny. I'm going to take an audience question. This is from Abdel Hamoushi. He says, "Thank you for the event. I think cultural identity and representation is a concern in Arab cinema in general. What's your take on this?"
Cultural identity and representation. I think we spoke about these aspects. Surely it's all these aspects are related to the diasporic experience and trying to relate to where you come from, and sometimes it's not a matter of choice. And for me, this wasn't a matter of choice. This was a necessity for me to exist. So it depends who you are and where you come from. I mean, not all Arab people have, cultural identity issues and representation issues. In the case of the Palestinians, I think is more, I would say, a necessity, because it's a question of existing or not existing. It could be now maybe an experience of the Syrian, of the Lebanese, of the Yemeni. So many countries are becoming like Palestine in many ways, or even the Egyptians who find themselves displaced now because of the regime they have in Egypt. So it can be many things.
Yeah. Maybe I can add to that question a bit as we wait to see if there are others coming in too, to say, your films do go back to your childhood homes often, and you spoke some about home, about in a way how cinema is home, but I want to also say that as you've lived in the diaspora for a while, last year or 2 years ago now, you made a short film. It's a long way from Amphioxus, that is about the waiting rooms in Berlin for people seeking asylum. So just, what led you to making that film in particular? And do you see yourself making more films set in the diaspora or outside Palestine as well?
Making this film was really a coincidence because I was asked by a friend to accompany her to apply for a residency in Berlin. So I had the time to revisit this building, this building that is called in German the foreigners entity. It's a very strange name. Ausländer.
What entity? Sorry, is that a German word, or did I?
Foreigners
entity. Okay, wow, yeah,
very strange name.
Yes.
And authority, foreigners authority or something like that. Yeah. So I had the time to wander around in this building, and I find myself in this building, in this room where it was packed with people. And I look around and I see many of them moving their lips, but without talking. I saw the first person. I thought there was something wrong with him. And I see another person, and then I realized they were all praying.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a group from Chechnya, and they were waiting for the final decision whether they could stay in Germany or not. So I had this idea of making a film there, and just to be with the people waiting, and somehow trying to relate this waiting to big questions of existence. That's why the title of this film, it's a long way from Amphioxus, because finally we all come from the same place as human being. And the scene you have in the film where an old lady asks a young man, what is it that they are distributing here? As things are, it's so crazy how sometimes reality, like fiction. She was a Syrian, and the person she asked was a young Palestinian. So for me, this scene in itself was really expressing, the state of mind we live in today in the Arab world, which in a way everywhere became like Palestine. People got displaced and they have to go abroad. They have to live other lives. And this particular old lady, she didn't know where she is actually. And really, this feeling was very important for me to work with, and to, again, subvert it with the numbers taking over the space and traveling to the city eventually, as you see in the film. So from one part, I am really interested in reality, but I'm not a documentarian. I'm not making films to simply show reality as it is, but to give it an interpretation, an artistic interpretation, which can be sometimes very fantastic.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any other questions coming in, so I do think that's a great place for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Kamal.
Thank you. My pleasure. And hope to see you soon sometime.
Thank you. I hope so too. And thank you to Mizna and to the Mosaic Rooms as well for hosting us.